Hello. Is that working?
Yeah.
Want to welcome everybody here. It's great to see you all for what we know is going to be a great story and an enjoyable evening for all of you. Just audience, gauge the audience here. How many people work in the Millyard currently? So we asked that. How many either used to work in the Millyard or have ancestors, relatives who? So a lot of connections there. How many people sort of know the Pandora story or parts of it? So some familiarity there. How many came because there's beer to be served later on? I'm sorry, where's all the hands? Where's all the hands on that? My name is John Weeks, and I work for Harvest Capital Management. We're a wealth management firm, but I'm introducing tonight because I want to tell you about the connection that I have with Ralph and how this whole thing sort of came together. Because this is a story, it's history, and it's something that I'm interested in for a number of reasons. First and foremost, I mean, I'm a New Hampshire kid, grew up in the Lakes region. Actually part of a family. My ancestor came to New Hampshire in 1650, and so I'm 10 generations down, and so anything that has to do with New Hampshire history, I'm very interested in, and I also, came back to New Hampshire in early mid-1990s, and when I came back, the Millyard was in total disrepair, really not much going on, and but it's, things started to come back and people started to have some impact on it. But it was, when I thought about the history of the Millyards, it's really sort of in its third generation now. Now that there's all these successful businesses in there, and I'd gotten to know Ralph when I first came back here. We played tennis together on Wednesday nights. There was a Wednesday night tennis group, and so I got to know Ralph and his connection to Pandora and that story. And so 2 years ago, there was an announcement in the paper about these 3 mill buildings that had been sold, and I knew that it was connected, and Ralph had been managing those, and it was sort of the last step of their family exiting the ownership of the business. And so I called Ralph and congratulated him. But I said, let's go to lunch. Can you have some time to go to lunch? So off to lunch we went, and we sat down, and I said, Ralph, I know some of the story here, but I don't know the whole story. Would you mind sharing with me the story of your family and Pandora? So I sat there for an hour and a half, and I just listened to Ralph tell me the story about the whole thing. And it was a fascinating story. And I'm thinking the whole time that there's a bigger audience that should hear this story. And so for the last 2 years, I've been trying to help pull this thing together so that people can hear the story as Ralph tells it. And who better to team up with to help Ralph tell the story but John Clayton. He's been on board the whole time. Really wanted to do that. Talked to Heather, the Greater Manchester Chamber. I met with her just because my company's member of the chamber. She comes and she's talking about what the things that we can do, and I said, well, I got to tell you the story, and so I tell her the story, and she's like, we want to do that. Can we be part of that too? And then I ran into Kaylee Bullock from Amoscake Beverage, and I was telling her, tell her story, and she's like, can we be involved? Can we be involved? And so Great North Aleworks is here because of Kaylee, and Brian's here tonight, and you'll hear more from him. So that just a roundabout way, but just to tell you how this all came together, how what I felt was a really compelling story that should be told, and obviously you've all responded to it and are curious about it too. So with that, I will get on with the show and enjoy tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, John, and thank you all for coming out on what is a very cold night. We have some very cold beer to make it feel even colder for you later. But first, we have a really heartwarming story to tell. One question I always ask, I'm the executive director here at the Millyard Museum. How many of you are here in the museum for the first time? Raise your hands. Okay, you can never say that again. Okay, and we expect to see you here again because we have a very compelling story to tell. Ralph is a personal owner of one of those great stories, so we would love to see you here more and more. By way of context, I will tell you that Pandora Industries did not come to Manchester until 1940. And that's important to know because one thing that John and Heather and I want to do in our mission here is to make newcomers to the Millyard aware of the history that exists in this place. If you don't know, all the more reason to come back here. In 1935, Amoskeag was the single largest textile manufacturing company in the world. And on Christmas Eve in 1935, because of failing economic enterprises, they filed for bankruptcy protection. Their intention was to reopen. They were in New York seeking financing to reopen this largest textile mill, but in March of '36, 3 months after their bankruptcy filing, the greatest flood ever to come roaring down the Merrimack River blasted the city of Manchester in two. And any hope Amoskeag ever had of opening was devastated, and the city of Manchester was facing what people called economic ruination. Luckily, a group of Manchester citizens got together and created an entity called Amoskeag Industries, which exists until this day, and their mission was to save Manchester for Manchester. They recruited businesses to come from all over the world to come and set up shop in the Millyard, and they were phenomenally successful. Among the greatest successes was Pandora Industries. And we are here with Ralph Sador. I will call you the scion of Amoskeag Industries, of Pandora Industries. Scion is the heir apparent, both in terms of spirit, reputation, dedication, and passion for the family brand. But I will tell you that 1940 is not when Pandora began, it began here. Ralph has a little bit of deep background I would love for him to talk about involving his grandfather and other family members. Ralph, I'm going to let you go from there. Tell us about your grandfather.
My grandfather was born in a small town in western central Poland. When he was a teenager, and this is either just before or just after the turn of the 20th century, he wanted to get out of the shtetl, which is the Jewish settlement, which was a very restrictive place in Eastern Europe. And he went to Berlin, and he got a job sweeping in a knitting factory. Knitting technology at that time was very highly controlled. Number one, Jews weren't allowed to be knitters. I mean, that was the rules at that time. But even beyond that, they tried to keep the monopolies on knitting, which was brand new technology in the late 1800s, to Germany and France, where it had been developed. My grandfather swept there for I don't know how long. I believe it was more than a year or two. I don't know. And at some point, he decided that he'd had enough, and he left, and he went back home, and he wanted to come to this country because he'd heard this was a land of opportunity. And he could not get an exit visa, and you needed an exit visa to get out of any part of the Russian Empire. Another gentleman in town, whom he knew, had gotten an exit visa and had changed his mind and decided to stay. So my grandfather and Mr. Blum switched identities. And he became Morris Bloom. That was not his name. I believe his name was Jacob Thuzina, but I'm not absolutely certain of that. And sometime in the first decade of the 20th century, he got on a boat and came over here. And he went, as did 99% of the Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe, to the Lower East Side of New York. And he needed a job, and he went to, I believe it was Hoboken, New Jersey, somewhere across the river, and there were ferries that went back and forth all the time, and went into a knitting factory that was looking for workers, and the guy said, "Can you run a knitting machine?" My grandfather, A, was absolutely full of brass. He never met a challenge he couldn't take on. B, he was mechanically inclined, and even though he had never done anything with the knitting machines in Berlin, he'd watched the knitters operate them and fix them and work them. And he said, "Sure." And if you knew my grandfather, that was absolutely the answer he would give. And the guy said, "Okay, there's a machine over there. Get it going again. The guy is off shift now." And my grandfather ran the machine. He worked there for a number of years. I don't know how many. And at some point, he was getting restless. And the owner said to him, "Climb up there and close those windows, will you?" And my grandfather looked at him and said, "Close them yourself," and he walked out. That part I know is true. He went back over to Manhattan, and he and a partner, and I don't know particularly who the partner was or how he met him, decided that they would open and operate their own knitting business. They understood it well enough. Now, in those days, things were much simpler. The bank wasn't an institution like we have here in town, you know, big brick or marble buildings. In the Jewish community, there were a couple of gentlemen who, in their own living rooms, took money in deposits from people who had a few pennies or dollars to save, and loaned them out so they could make a little money on it. And that was the banker he dealt with. They borrowed enough money so that they could rent some space, and there was plenty of factory space all over the city. They could buy yarn on credit, and that was available. They could lease machinery, that was available, and they could hire a few workers. He had a friend, and I believe this was Mr. Paneth, who got them some orders, and they started making sweaters, children's sweaters, for other marketers, people who actually marketed the sweaters under a label or two customers. This went on for a number of years. They were very, very successful. And sometime in the mid-20s, my grandfather, who at that point was probably around 40, decided to retire. They sold the business. They did very, very well. And my grandfather decided that it was the time of the automobile. And he invested his money in parking garages and parking lots in New York City. And he borrowed very heavily to do that, and bought as much as he could because he wanted the income to support his lifestyle. He and my grandmother were married in 1911. My mother was born in 1912, my uncle in 1919. So at this point, he was a responsible family man with two growing kids. They'd eventually moved from the Lower East Side to the Bronx and then to New Rochelle, where my mother went to grade school, and then back to the city. And they lived in the Bronx for I think they were there until the early 50s, so another 25 or 30 years.
Can I interject for 1 second? Man, this is the problem with guys like Ralph and me sharing a microphone. It ain't gonna work out, okay? We're gonna work this best. When Ralph and I were having this conversation as a prep a couple weeks ago, when he started describing the analogy of the Jewish bankers in the neighborhood, the absolute parallel to Manchester was to St. Mary's Bank, where the Franco-American immigrants here simply didn't trust the Yankee bankers on Elm Street, and they took their money home and they put it under the mattress, and a series of tenement fires would devastate an entire series of families. So the Catholic Church here in Manchester, through Monsignor Pierre Heavey at St. Mary's, created St. Mary's Bank specifically to serve that clientele. Ralph's was a little more informal, the Jewish neighborhood in New York, but think about the parallels. And think about the genius of his grandfather who decided to invest in parking. I wonder if anybody in the Millyard is thinking along the same lines today. Parking in the Millyard. So this is how Ralph and I have a conversation. We're going to fight over the microphone. It's back to Ralph. A tennis match, John.
One other comment to be made is that St. Mary's was, of course, founded by French-speaking people who spoke virtually exclusively French,
Yes.
although some of them, maybe they wouldn't admit it publicly,
Right.
but spoke English as well. My grandfather went to the Yiddish-speaking people in Lower Manhattan, and maybe a few of them spoke English, but Yiddish was their language. My mother and father grew up speaking Yiddish. They only learned English in school, and they were fully integrated within a few years.
That's great.
And I think that's a whole
Parallels,
story
yeah.
about immigrants coming to this country now. They got the business going. He got the parking going and was doing fine, and then 1929 hit. And with the big bust, all of a sudden people weren't driving their cars, weren't driving them into the city, didn't need parking, and the cash flow dried up, and my grandfather desperately worked to sell everything he had, and he managed to sell and use up all of his own assets, keeping the bankers clear. And that was critical to him because he knew he'd have to go back to work, and the only way to do that was with borrowed money. 1931 was when this occurred. My dad, who at that point was in his, would have been 23, 24, had been a draftsman for the New York City subway system. He got laid off sometime, I think, in 1930, because they were under financial pressure, of course. And he then got a job working for the highway department in Albany. And he was commuting every week up to Albany for Monday through Friday, and then back down to the city for the weekend, because he and my mom had been seeing each other for a couple of years at that point and would get married in 31. In the summer of 31, Dad got laid off by the state. Mom had graduated from NYU with a degree in classics in the spring of that year, and she was working selling hosiery in Gimbels. They had saved, since they'd been going together for 4 or 5 years at that point, they'd saved something approximating $1,500, which is a lot of money in 1931. As they were getting ready to get married and go on a honeymoon, my grandfather sat down with them and said, look, he said, I don't have a job. You don't have a real job, May, and Saul, you don't have a job. I know how to run a knitting business, and my friend Mr. Paneth can get us orders because there are people still buying sweaters for their kids. He said, let me use your trousseau as surety, and I will get us a factory going where we can work. And once we're working and getting paid, we're going to be doing better than most of the people around. My folks got married in early October of 1931, and they went on a honeymoon. They came back 3 weeks later, and not only was the factory up and running, it was really running. He had rented space, he'd leased machinery, he'd gotten yarn on credit, he'd gotten some people to work because everybody was looking for work, and he was able to hire qualified people. And Mr. Paneth had gotten them some orders. So they started taking orders and making them, and they were making enough that they were paying themselves. And paying themselves in 1931, they could make a go of it. They had no children until 36, so that wasn't an issue at the time. The factory was busy, and then at some point, the next couple of years, things slowed down a little bit. My mom took samples of some of the sweaters, packed them in a case, and went down to Macy's. There was a children's sweater buyer in Macy's, and if you waited in the outer office I don't know what day of the week it was, and I don't know what time of the day it was. At that time, she would see everybody was there in turn. You could show her what you had. Mom went in. Here's a young woman in her mid-20s, and went in and sat down and showed the lady what she had. I'm sure they were quality because my grandfather knew how to make good sweaters. And she said, this is what we offer. This is the kind of delivery we can give you. And the lady said, I'll give you an order, and gave her an order. And Mom said, you're giving me an order, but you don't know me. She said, you came here with all this work. You're not here to cheat me. You're going to deliver the sweaters, and we're going to do well. And that was her first order. They then decided that they needed a label. And my mother decided that it should be something that stood out. So she looked at the names, and there was Blum, there was Sidor, and then she said, oh, and there's Mr. Paneth. And if I take the first part of Mr. Paneth's name and the last part of the Sidor name, that's Pandora. Mom was a classic scholar, Pandora, the Greek demigoddess. When I went to work at the factory in 1971, we still had some of the old boxes that had been using for many years, which were a little sweater box, printed to look like a chest, Pandora's chest. Okay. We hadn't been making them for a few years, but there was still some left in the warehouse.
Allow me to jump in. Thank you, Ralph. And when we had this conversation, I, again, was open mouth in the same way you had the allegory to St. Mary's Bank and the parking, and now the name of the company. Another Jewish family from Manchester, the Revson family, started a cosmetics business with a partner named Lackman. And they decided, like Pandora, they wanted to marry their two names into a corporate name that would resonate beyond the Revson family name. Well, Mr. Lackman's name and Revson, if you're selling beauty products and cosmetics, you don't want to call it Revlac. It sounds like paint thinner. So what they decided on was the softer sounding Revlon, which is how so many people in Manchester lost sight of the fact that the largest cosmetics company in the world, had its roots here in Manchester with the three Revson brothers. So the parallels are uncanny, and I interrupted Ralph for the second time. Back to Ralph. I only get three, Frankie said. So.
They were doing okay. They were busy. Their people were employed. I don't know if they were making a fortune, but they were doing okay. In 1940, they were working one day, and a man walks in the door. And he says, oh, I didn't know how big you were. I don't know if they had 20 or 30 employees at the time, 40. And he said, I'm from the union, and we'll be back to tell you how to run your business. My grandfather was not thrilled. That's the polite form of the expression. My parents were very concerned. Also, something my parents told me about that I never experienced. This was before the start of World War II. And New York was a very significant German-American community. And there was a lot of anti-Semitism in New York. and they had seen some of it, and it bothered them a great deal. They weren't sure they wanted to raise their family. At that point, they had my older brother and sister, who had been born in 36 and 38. They decided they didn't want to stay. A salesman, I think it was Mr. Paneth, but I'm not sure, had been up in New England on some of his sales trips and said, you know, I was in this town up there in New Hampshire, and they had this huge Millyard that used to be a textile factory, and it went out of business, and they got all this space, and they got a lot of people there who are accustomed to handling cloth. Not knitting technology, which is totally different from weaving technology, but cloth. My dad went up and took a look and told my grandfather that we were moving. And my grandfather didn't want to object because he didn't want anything to do with the union. They moved, and I was told it was over Thanksgiving weekend of 1940. I don't know, I wasn't around. The story I was told was that they loaded the machinery, which at that point they owned, onto flatbed trucks and drove it up here. 1940, there were no interstates. The Merritt Parkway existed, but trucks weren't allowed on it. So they took the old route, Route 1, and then Route 5 and 15 up north to Massachusetts, and then east on, I assume, Route 9 or Route 20, through part of Boston, and then up to Manchester on Route 3. And I was told, and again, I have no idea, that they felt there were people following them, and that in the back bay, they lost them. Doesn't surprise me at all. The first location they had was the building across the way, which I call the Autodesk building, on the 4th floor, the next to the top floor. And they were there from 1940 until sometime in 1950. They also had a dye house, and I don't know where the dye house was. During the war, they were tied down with government business. The government gave them the yarn and said, you'll make these sweaters to these specs for our soldiers. They made these sweaters to these specs for the soldiers. If there was a little yarn left over, they could make some consumer goods with that. But the biggest place they did well, do you have a little water, John?
I'll get that. Oh, here.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, my voice is going already.
Okay. We fill in for you while you take that drink. Yeah, we had this conversation, and to look around these different mill buildings in the Millyard and recognize the legacy of the Pandora family businesses, not just in the one iconic building which now houses UNH Manchester, but how many buildings your family did business in. Ralph, I'm sorry, Frankie, I know you're here. This guy could have dated any girl in high school if they knew that he ran the Pandora factory shop. Remember all those cars that go off the highway?
Worked there, I didn't run it.
He worked at the register, that's what matters. We'll get to that later.
The big thing during the war was the dyeing business. Dyeing is a very interesting business. A customer wants you to dye yarn for them. They ship you arbitrarily 100 pounds. It was usually in much larger quantities than that. Your obligation is to return to them 97 pounds of dyed yarn, correctly dyed. If you're a good dyer and you don't make any mistakes, that 3% of the yarn is yours. However, dye stuffs, the powders and stuff that go into the coloring, weigh. They may weigh 2, 3, 4, 5 pounds per hundredweight. So you're actually getting 7 or 8 pounds of yarn out of every lot of 100. And if you're doing 1,000-pound lots or 600-pound lots, and a lot of them, and you have good quality, you pick up a lot of yarn very quickly. They made consumer sweaters out of the leftover yarn and sold them to a market that was hungry for consumer goods all over the country, very hungry. And they had no cost of materials. The yarn was free.
Wow.
This is perfectly legitimate and above board. It's the way business was done. And that helped them during the war to do very well. In addition, the government kept them busy with military goods. After the war, things changed fairly quickly. Everybody coming home, there was a glut of labor. There was no longer need for all the military industries, arms industries. So there was a lot of people, and right after the war, things were slow. Mom, and this is in early 1947 or late 46, and she was pregnant with my next younger sister. I was born in 44. packed up sweaters, and went on a road trip. I know among other places she went to Philadelphia, Baltimore, Pittsburgh, and Cleveland. I assume she went to Chicago as well, and possibly Washington, D.C. And she went on a sales trip, hauling around these suitcases, the sample cases, and she sold enough goods to get the factory going at full blast again. And within a couple of years, they had a national sales force. They were doing business nationally, and Pandora grew. In 1949, they bought what is now the UNH building. And at the time, it was occupied by a number of other businesses. But there were at least 2 or 3 floors clear, which is what they needed for their operations. Plus, the basement was a dye house. I think it was already a dye house from Amoskeag. I'm not sure of that. And in 1950, after having some work done, they moved over. And while the equipment was rigged over with trucks and cranes and everything, a lot of the people and everything went across. There was an overhead bridge. And I don't know how many of you remember that, but there were overhead bridges in a number of places throughout the Millyard where people and sometimes goods could be moved back and forth between the buildings. So they started over there in 1950. The company was distributed nationally. The Pandora name was very well respected. They made a good quality sweater. The apparel business is divided into a number of markets: budget, moderate, better, designer. There may be subgroups within that. Pandora was in the moderate business. They did not try and compete with the high fashion people in the better business or in the designer business. And that set sort of limits on their pricing. And within their pricing, they were a very competitive business. Their basic sweaters, the basic crew neck, the basic cardigan, were staples in the industry. And they could make those almost on a year-round basis and have market for them because people were always buying those kind of basic sweaters. This is the 50s. This was not wild fashion times. Things were fairly conservative then. They started opening up a few years later. They started coordinating their sweaters with some skirts, I think, and pants, I'm not sure, sometime in the mid to late 50s. And then they started a skirt making operation in Long Island City, which is in Queens, right across the river from Manhattan. That was a union shop because you couldn't open a shop in New York unless it was union. And they kept that as a totally separate business. But they controlled the colors. And I don't know how many of you remember, the number one strength of Pandora as a sportswear source was that the sweaters and the sportswear matched. And that was what they spent an awful lot of time working on. In the mid-50s, I think in 55, my dad decided that there should be, they had to do something to get rid of their extra sweaters without getting really slaughtered by the people who were the bottom feeders. So we opened at this end of what is now the UNH building on the ground floor, a little store as an outlet. Within a year or two, when it was open during the busy season, they would have as many as 5 or 6 policemen out there directing traffic and trying to keep people straight. Now, this is the old Millyard. There were buildings on both sides. There's another row of buildings in front here, another row of buildings down here.
Canals.
Canals was still there, okay? So this is a whole different ball of wax than what you see now. The police had to direct traffic, had to help people find parking, had to keep the pedestrians safe. After a few years, the place was just overwhelmed, and they rented space where the Pandora factory store became from Davidson Construction at the what I call the factory store building. And they moved over there, and that place was in business for about 30 years and was, to the best of our knowledge, the first true factory outlet for apparel in the country.
Anybody shop there? Anybody? Yeah, right, you did. One more. I'm going to steal it from Ralph one more time. The first time I drove to Florida, anybody ever done that? Third time, yes. You're driving to Florida and you hit, south of Washington, all of a sudden you start seeing these crazy signs for this place called South of the Border.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Well, you see Pedro and Pablo and South of the Border. Pandora had one sign on what would qualify today as the Ever Turnpike. And it was the equivalent of the South of the Border sign. Everybody knew, oh my God, Harriet, we have to get off at this exit. The girls need sweaters. We're going to Pandora. It was unbelievable. Ralph's story about traffic cops is not an exaggeration. They had to navigate people through the canals to get to the shop when it was at the factory. And when it went on to Canal Street, I think that's when they made it 4 lanes. I think it was your fault.
I'm not so sure about that, John. The factory store was very, very successful. It wasn't looked at so much as a profit source as it was as a saving of investment, because we were able to get prices in the factory store that were far better than what we got selling off to wholesalers. They also were able to use up extra raw materials, extra yarns, and when we got into sportswear, extra fabric, because they could make in the off-season X number of hundreds of dozens of this, that, this, and that, and put them in the factory store at reduced prices. And that helped everybody. There were seconds over there, there were irregulars, there were closeouts, which is simply left over at the end of a season. The business is complex, involves a lot of planning, and there are mistakes made. In fact, mistakes are part of the business. In the mid-50s, my uncle, who had started in the business in 1939 or 40 in New York and came up here with it, he was my grandfather's only son, and my grandfather wanted him to run the business in his place. And that started a real problem in the family. My dad had been running it up here for, at that point, 14 or 15 years. He had a good handle on how to handle it, and he wasn't enthused. My uncle was a very, very good technician. He could design and make a beautiful sweater. And in terms of planning and delivering successfully to customers, which was one of the things that we were known for. Let me give you an example. When a customer in Minnesota writes an order for $1,000 worth of sweaters, he does not expect to get $1,000 worth. From most companies, he feels he's lucky if he gets 500 or 600. From Pandora, our average was 900. That kind of reliability, and believe it or not, 9 out of 10 is reliable, was important to our customers because they knew we'd give them a fair shake. My uncle's approach to planning was more like the other people, and my dad was very concerned about that. And I can't get into the specifics of who did what because I don't know, I wasn't involved. I know that my dad was very concerned. When the year was over, he got back involved, called a lot of people, made a lot of apologies, and got the business back on track. In 1960, my grandfather decided to make an issue out of it, and a battle began in the family over control of the company. The company itself was not affected. They were smart enough to keep it away from the company itself. Dad ran the company, but the control of the company was being decided. And there were lawyers involved, and there was other things, and it was terrible. I learned about it at this time. I was 16, and one summer after I'd finished summer camp, my dad took me aside and told me what was going on. In 1964, in January, with this going on, and this had dragged out for 3 or 4 years, my dad had a heart attack and died. This was 6 weeks after Jack Kennedy had died. My mother was very concerned because she felt that my grandfather really didn't care about employees, and my uncle would follow my grandfather's lead. Now, there's a lot of background to this. Pandora, back in the late 40s when they were up here, my dad started having quarterly meetings. Everybody in the company would come into one of the large manufacturing rooms and stand or sit where they could, and he would tell them what was going on with the business. And these could be long discussions, and the employees could ask questions, so they'd understand what they were doing, what their part was in it, why they were doing what they were doing. And he was honest with them. The company started around 1950 health benefits. Nobody in the textile industry had health benefits for their hourly workers. He started a retirement plan. Nobody in the industry had that. They weren't liberal with their vacations, but they had a good vacation policy and a good holiday policy. So that people had benefits, real benefits, and they could appreciate them. my mom was very concerned about the employees. By this time, Pandora probably had somewhere between 600 and 900 employees I'm talking about early 1964. Mom was very concerned about the people because she and Dad had worked as a team. To go back a little bit, when I was a kid growing up, Dad would come home from work, and at the dinner table, the rest of us were under orders to keep our mouths shut, and Mom and Dad would talk in Yiddish, which none of us understood. We knew from the names that he was telling her about what was going on at the work, and he discussed everything with her. It could be an hour discussion. We were allowed to eat and leave. At one point, my brother was studying German in high school, and German and Yiddish are very close, and they got mad at him because he was starting to understand what they were saying when he was home. So Mom knew what was going on. Mom had done the selling twice on the road. She'd been to New York a lot with my dad in the design studio, which was in New York, and the main sales room was in New York, understood some of that. She had a lot to do with who the people were. They had brought in an industrial psychologist to help them with management working together, because with 900 people, 900 people, you have to have a number of managers, and it has to be a structured authority, and people have to work together. The lawyers got together and made a decision, and they agreed, to which my grandfather and uncle on one side and my mom on the other agreed, that she would have 90 days to put together the money to buy them out, and there was a price stated. If she couldn't buy them out for that money, they would have to buy her out for that money, and that would have resolved the problem. Mom went to let it be known what was going on. A number of the salesmen, some of whom were extremely successful, came to her with offers of money for her to borrow. Old friends came to her and loaned her money, and she had the wherewithal, the company itself, to mortgage against it. And she bought my uncle and my grandfather out. And that ended that part of the dispute. The company then went through 12 or so years of pretty good times. Sweaters were good. They were doing the sportswear in New York. In 1969, an opportunity occurred here in Manchester. There was a factory over at Lincoln and Auburn Streets called Tam O'Shanter. They made sportswear, primarily knitted sportswear. It's a different approach. You can knit fabric, or you can knit sweaters. And it all has to do with the size of the yarn and how tightly it's woven. What they did was called cut and sewn. They would knit blanks of cloth and cut them into shapes and then sew them together. They bought the factory in '69. In 1971, no, I'm way ahead of myself. About 10 years later, they moved it over to 150 Dow Street. 150 Dow Street was bought with a partner in 1956 or 57 as a warehouse. Within a few years, they had moved one manufacturing operation over there, and they had moved their executive offices over there to make room in this building for more manufacturing operations, because you really have to have your sweater manufacturing integrated. In 1962, I believe, might have been a year or two later, they bought the building the factory store was in. In 1974, 5, or 6, when the public service buses were turned over to Manchester Transit built the garage down on Lower Elm Street, and the public service pension plan put the building, which is now Fit Lab, it was Gold's Gym for many years, on the market, and Pandora bought it at auction. We bought it, number one, to provide more parking for our factory store across the street. But eventually it was developed. Burlington Coat was in there, Linens and Things. Then they built the stores in addition behind it, and there have been a number of places in there, including at one point the DMV licensing office. That's how the real estate developed. Let me start again. Making a sweater is time consuming. Sweaters are generally knit in tubes of cloth, which is then cut and sewn together. It takes virtually as much time to knit a children's sweater as it does to knit a woman's sweater. Because of that, and because of the costing involved, and because we were in a tightly costed market, we were being forced to make children's sweaters in our own mill and send the more profitable women's sweaters out to contractors, primarily in the greater New York area. This created enormous strains, and in '76, a decision was made to close the children's division. This was a very, very tough decision because that was our original business. That's what my grandfather had done going back to the early 1900s. 2 years there, 76 and 77, were the only real terrible loss years in the company's history. They lived through it. In '78, they hired a new sales manager who recognized preppy as being the look at the time, and they developed a label called Waterville that was very, very successful. Basic sweaters, khaki pants, button-down shirts, polo, stuff like that.
Kind of like what you're wearing right now. The classics never go out of style.
With my shape, the classics are the only thing. And got the company back on its feet. About that time, my mom would have been 69, 68, 69, and she and her husband, she had remarried in '67, Mr. Gruber, and they were interested in doing their own things. They didn't want to be tied down to the business. So she and Al Alter, a Manchester native who had been with the company since the late '40s and was her #2 man. He was executive vice president. And after she officially retired, which didn't mean anything in '76, the president, he and she and our industrial psychologist, who'd been with us at that point for over 30 years, Dr. Fred Jervis from Durham, met together with me. And I knew it was coming. They asked me if I wanted to take over the business. And I had thought about this. And I said to them I did not. I would say that I did not have my grandfather's self-assurance. I did not feel that I had my dad's way with people. He was very, very good with people. And I really didn't have the same business head that he had. And I was concerned that I was responsible for, at that point, it was over 1,000 employees, counting our other operations, and for my mother's future. And both of those were important considerations to me. So I said no. They then began looking for a buyer, and they were very concerned that they get the right buyer. Because again, one of the important considerations was the people who were tied into the business for their livelihood. I know that somebody approached them and said, let me sell the business for you. He wasn't offering to buy it, he was offering to sell it for them, which meant he'd get a commission. They told him in no uncertain terms, and let it be known elsewhere, that nobody was authorized to sell anything on behalf of the company. Eventually, they made a deal with somebody they knew through the Knitted Outerwear Association, which is the national trade association for the knitwear industry. And the gentleman involved was a senior executive of Kaiser Roth Hosiery, which was a major, major textile firm owned by Gulf and Western. And I'm sure the older people here will remember that that was a huge, major conglomerate in the late '70s and early '80s. The deal was done and it closed on September 15th, 1983. I stayed on with the company. I was at that point running customer service, distribution, and inventory planning for the sportswear division. And I was busy, we were involved. The executive that took us over was a very, very smart man, later proving out to be too smart. And 2 years later, Gulf and Western made a strategic decision to get out of the consumer and industrial products business. They sold Kaiser Roth, of which we were a small division, and a number of other businesses to a West Coast firm that had gone into bankruptcy a few years before and had a huge tax loss carry forward. That means that they lost zillions of dollars in their bankruptcy, and they could write that off against profits. And the Consumer Industrial Products Division of Kaiser Roth, of Gulf and Western, was a profitable business. That's why that deal happened. The group executive that we had dealt with wanted a place for himself because he felt that they wouldn't have a place for him. And he took Pandora and 6 other small divisions. We were the biggest at 40 million. The others were somewhere from between 3 and 5 and 15 or 20 million apiece. He took us private. My understanding is that he bought over $20 million worth of assets for $250,000 cash. Everything else was credit. He was a smarter operator than he thought he was. And within 2 years, he put the companies into bankruptcy. He got a Merrill Lynch venture capital group to help him. A year later, they bought it out of bankruptcy. And a year and a half later, they closed the business. When we did the deal with Gulf and Western, they did not want the real estate. Mom had originally been going to sell that to them too, but they didn't want it. And there were reasons that don't matter, tax reasons and stuff. So Mom kept the buildings. For about 8 years, she and Mr. Alter ran it. And then he wanted to retire. He was at that point in his early 70s and wanted to move to Florida. He's still alive. He's 95 and living in Northern Virginia. You would appreciate that. And in early 92, they asked me if I was interested in getting involved. And I, at that point, was looking for something to do and took it on. Mom passed away in 2013, 2 days before her 101st birthday. I sold the business in the end of January 2017. And that's the end of Pandora. Anything else you want me to say?
Yes, I do, because that's not the end of the Pandora story. And one of the reasons we asked Ralph to come here today is because, again, those new people coming into the Millyard, those new entrepreneurs, those new venture capitalists who come here, it's a great thing to open a business and hire people. And in the case of Pandora, we're going to talk about social responsibility for a while, to give them a good job, but also with good benefits, looking out for their welfare and the family's welfare. And we want people to know that. It's not just about opening a business. Love your workers, care for your workers, because that's what May did.
And Saul.
And Saul, I'm sorry, forgive me, Saul Sador, whose name still adorns a speaker series at University of New Hampshire at Manchester, at Durham. I talked to a person at Hannaford today. I was picking up your snacks for the evening. And he stopped me and I mentioned we were gonna have to sit down with Ralph. He goes, his father's name still adorns a lecture series at the University of New Hampshire, bringing remarkably bright and progressive people to talk to kids at the university to this day. That's part of the legacy of Pandora Industries. So it's not just those benefits, those employees who are there on that day. We all benefit mightily. My friend Rich Siegel is sitting here. His mom was best friends with your mom, Selma Deitch. And I'm going to ask Ralph to talk about the social responsibility we talk about today for businesses is emblematic in Pandora. Not just the employees again, but the community at large. And there are multiple surfaces, and you don't like one question to cover them all, but that's what you got. Talk about the many ways in which Pandora benefits us all today, still today.
As John said, the Solicitor Memorial Foundation, which is my siblings and now 2 more generations of the family, sponsors the Sador Lecture Series at all 4 principal campuses of the university system: Keene, Plymouth, Manchester, and Durham. And we keep an eye on it, and we try and make sure that it stays to its original purpose, which is to bring interesting and, to some extent, cutting-edge ideas in any academic field to the attention of the students and the citizens of the area. The events are required to be free and open to the public. And if you hear about anything and it's of interest, go. These things are frequently full, but not always. And some of them don't work. We don't care. We want them to try and do the right kinds of things. Mom started that, and then when she married Mr. Gruber, she felt it was inappropriate to be running a foundation in her husband's memory, in her first husband's memory, while married to the second husband. So she turned it over to the children in 68 or 69. I came back from the service and college in 71. If you can't count, that means I was 27. I was 27, and yes, I took 7 years to get through college, 3 of which were spent in the Army, thank you. And the kids, my siblings and I, and now the other 2 generations have been running it ever since. When the company was sold, the foundation got a portion of the money that we had some shares in the company, and that's been developed into the point where we're doing, we think, some real good in this area. Not just the lecture series, we do other things. One of the things that my stepfather talked about when he came up to Manchester, and he'd never been in this area before as far as I know, was he had grown up in Stamford, Connecticut, where they had what they called a settlement house. And a settlement house was a place that was where the kids especially could go, and they could play games, they could study music, they could study art, they could study all those kinds of things that were of cultural benefit. It wasn't trying to teach them to be good students, wasn't trying to teach them to be good engineers, it was trying to give them some rounding. He studied the violin there, eventually the cello, and he also learned to paint there. And he and I didn't always get along, but I could always listen to him play the cello, and I could always appreciate, to some extent, his art. I'm not a great fan of modern art. He wasn't a modern artist, but that's okay. He said, "Where's the art and music?" Well, we had the Courier, but that wasn't, at the time, as central a part of the community as it has become since then. And that's not because of them. We had some music schools. We had a little bit of music in the schools, but not a lot. And he wanted there to be a major public music and art school. In about 1980, they started the Greater Manchester Center for Arts and Music. Initially, it was at the house I grew up in on Trenton Street off North Elm. After a few years, it was moved to behind the bus garage, one of the offices back there, then to the second floor of the bus garage. Maybe it was reverse. Then, as they were expanding, they moved to Hanover Street, to the south side of Hanover Street. There was a building with an elevator.
Oddfellows Hall.
Was it Oddfellows Hall?
Yes,
With an operated elevator.
yeah. Manual elevator still today.
Okay. Up on the 4th or 5th floor, and people wanted to come there, they came. They were them, and the only other real large place to study music in the city was Ted Hebert's. And they all did a good job, no question. Eventually, in the late 90s, the music school moved up to North Elm after Notre Dame closed, or early 2000s. And they're still there today. They nurtured it for the first 10 or 12 years. They did everything. They ran it, they hired, they fired. When they went to Europe on trips, my stepfather would pick up all the student violins he could find. These are inexpensive violins that are good enough for students to learn on. He picked up sheet music that was appropriate for learning, and he provided tons of it to the school. Mom helped them with management issues, which was her strength. Personnel, benefits, coordination. And eventually in the 90s, it was turned over to an independent board of directors, and it's still functioning today. A number of years earlier, they decided to start a music camp in the summer for chamber musicians. I believe it started on the campus at St. Anselm. After a couple of years, I believe it moved to the campus of New Hampshire College, now SNU. After a few years there, it was taken over by another group, and they have since moved it, I believe, down to Massachusetts somewhere, Newburyport or someplace like that. I'm just not absolutely sure. It's my understanding that that is still going strong. A dear friend of my mother's was Rich's mother, Selma Deitch Siegel. Selma Deitch's father delivered me. Okay, Selma and my mom were friends from, as far as I know, when Mom moved up here in 1940. Selma was local. And my mom told me, and I don't know how apocryphal this is, that she introduced Selma, after Saul Siegel's wife had died of very young age, to Saul, and she feels she match made them. My mom, maybe she did, maybe she didn't, I don't know.
Rich is doing this.
I can't see Rich, but I'm not arguing with him. Selma was a pediatrician. She worked for the state for many years. Around 1970, with Mom's encouragement, she and another lady named Ruth Butler started a consulting service on health delivery systems for children. And after a number of years of that, Mom and she were talking about it, and Mom said, you know, you've been telling other people how to do this, you ought to do it yourself. And that was the beginning, I believe, of Child Health Services. Mom made a major grant to them to help them get started. And that is still going today. It's now part of the Manchester Community Health Center, MCHC. Unfortunately, we lost Selma about 15, 16 years ago. But the institution is still doing pretty good. In the mid-90s, she'd done all this through the Gruber Foundation, which was the vehicle she and my late stepfather had used for their charitable giving. He died in '96, and Mom wanted to do something to distribute the last funds from the foundation. So we sat at a meeting, and Selma and a lady named Rona Zlakauer, who worked for Selma, were advisors to our foundation. And she said, what do we have that we can do that would be significant? And they came back to us at another meeting and proposed a organization that would try and educate children for responsible use of media. It is now called Media Power Youth. I've forgotten its earlier name.
That's what it is now. You're correct.
That's what it is now. They had a previous name. Mm-hmm. And the logic for Media Power Youth was Empower Youth. Empower Youth. Okay, that was the logic. I never thought it meant anything, but they did. That organization is still going. It is very successful. It has successful in terms of programming. It has programs in the schools here in Manchester that try and teach children responsible use of media. They have an anti-bullying program that's starting to be spread statewide. They've been recognized by the state. They've gotten consulting contracts from the Attorney General's office for educating our school teachers on the best ways to deal with certain kinds of situations. They're national. They've gotten national recognition, and their programs are starting to be distributed nationally. Again, Mom provided the wherewithal to get them going. Another program that wasn't as successful, Mom was always concerned with manufacturing. And in the early 90s, she met with the people at UNH, primarily the business school, and started a program on manufacturing management called the Manchester Manufacturing Management Center. This is the one program she started that I feel did not work out. The lady from the business school who was running it, the doctor, professor of business, used it to do some things that she wanted to do, not necessarily what we hoped it would do. And it would eventually taken over by the small business development centers, and it's basically disappeared. But this was a wide range of activities to try and help a lot of things that Mom was interested in and thought she could do some good at. And I think that answers your question.
It does. It does. Again, we talk about a legacy. It goes beyond the buildings, and we celebrate here in the Millyard Museum. If you've not seen our Manchester Wall of Fame as you walk in, May Gruber is among the featured people there. To my immediate left, if you've never seen a Pandora sweater, now's your time. We've updated our permanent exhibit. We have sweaters over here. And it's a legacy that Ralph helps to perpetuate by telling this story today. There's another way to perpetuate the legacy. This book is called Pandoras Pride. This is the autobiography of May Gruber. It's a fascinating read. It's normally available in our gift shop for the princely sum of $18.95. But in recognition of Ralph being here today, and because we want you to perpetuate the Pandora story, it's available for $10 this evening. So if you'd like to purchase the book, our gift shop will be open before you leave. And before you leave, a gentleman named Brian Pardas in the back of the room, I'd like Brian to come up because we had a sponsor for this evening's event. Talk about manufacturing in Manchester. They make beer. The Great North Ale Works in Manchester. We're so gracious to help us sponsor this event this evening. Amos Keg Beverages is our go-to point. Brian has been a part of several fundraising beer tastings we've done here at the Millyard Museum. Great friends of ours, and since we know you want to stick around and ask Ralph questions, I deliberately did not allow you to ask from the audience, so you'd stay to have a beer with me. So know that, but Brian's gonna tell us a little bit about their product. Brian?
Thank you for having us. Yeah, just great beer and great storytelling seem to go hand in hand for all of time. But yeah, I'm from Great North Works. My name's Brian, and we're in the modern industrial park in Manchester. So just off of East Industrial Park Drive, near the Union Leader and Hitachi Cable, Comcast, and a couple other businesses. But yeah, we're always happy to support anything here at the Millyard Museum because we find it so interesting and fascinating, the manufacturing history of Manchester. So I welcome you to come visit our large production facility over there off Exit 6 if you'd like to sometime. And in the meantime, yeah, please join us for a beer or a glass of wine and some more stories. Thank you.
Once again this evening, it has been my great pleasure to have as our guest Ralph Sador. Thank you, Ralph. Because I'm not kind of guy, and so is he. Frankie, could we ask you to stand up and say hello to the folks in the crowd? Frankie Sador, come on, you're out there. That's where the story is. I'm meeting Frankie at the bar. Thank you all for coming.